at least in my mind, insofar as possible, we need to be drawing a nexus between the mental issue and the alleged conduct, and then taking it a couple steps farther. What about that mental issue will make the defendant vulnerable if prison is imposed? And given the person's mental issues, what type of probationary sentence and other forms of treatment would be meaningful in order to protect the community and prevent that person from reoffending?
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, it's Doug Passon, back in Studio 3553, Scottsdale, Arizona. We are talking mental health today, mental health at sentencing, really. But I'm excited because here today helping us get set for sentencing, a colleague, a friend, an author, an attorney, teacher by the name of Elizabeth Kelley. Hi, thank you for being here, Elizabeth
Well, thank
Kelley.
you. It's an honor to be in Studio 3553.
Thank you. So just a little bit more about Ms. Kelley. She's the editor of 4 books. Yes, you heard that right. 4 books, all published by the American Bar Association, the ABA. One is Representing People with Mental Disabilities, a practical guide for criminal defense lawyers. Another is Representing People with Autism Spectrum Disorders, a practical guide for criminal defense lawyers. Suicide and its impact on the criminal justice system with Francesca Flood. And her latest, I believe this is your latest book, right? Just published, Representing People with Dementia, a practical guide for criminal defense lawyers. So the common theme is practical guide. Now, I confess I haven't read all of these books, but I was fortunate enough to receive a copy of Representing People with Autism Spectrum Disorders, because you know that's an issue that's near and dear to my heart. We've had one other podcast episode on autism early on. I'm going to put that link in the show notes. But practical guide is really the operative word of these books, because they really are just filled with practice tips. Every other page, practice tips. And this is I'm so excited for you to be here, because the truth is, we don't know what we don't know when it comes to disabilities. Lawyers, we would like to think we know everything all the time, but we don't. And this is an area where I have, in my life and in my practice, found myself to be most deficient. You know, sometimes sitting with a client and they're just really giving me a hard time. They're misbehaving. And I think, oh, they're a real jerk, that client. And at the end of the day, I figure out, oh, no, they're not. They've got an issue. They've got some problem. And so I'm not going to speak for the whole legal community, but I need to get better at understanding how to recognize these issues and what to do to develop them, and what to do to understand why they mean something, why they're relevant to mitigation, it's sentencing, and perhaps sometimes maybe the greatest hurdle, how to convince the decision makers what this is and why it matters. Because sometimes, as you know, and we'll talk about today, it's like banging your head against a brick wall for the judges or prosecutors to understand that this is real. This is impacting culpability. This is impacting the kinds of sentences that our people will serve. This is mitigating, and it matters. So let's dig in. I would love to just hear, I mean, this is what you do. This is your specialty.
This is my life. This is my mission.
This is your mission. We probably have to talk about wellness issues too, because lawyers have a hard job, but it strikes me that swimming in the waters of mental health all day, every day create its own series of issues. But maybe I'm jumping ahead. This is your life. Give me your origin story. How did this become your life?
Well, once upon a time, I was in a courtroom and I was representing another client, and the judge was going around the courtroom assigning various attorneys to indigent clients. And there was one gentleman who needed an attorney. So at the end of the docket, I was the last one standing, and he said, Miss Kelley, would you be willing to represent this client? And what do you say? I said, well, yes, thank you, Your Honor. So I went to the podium and I had a meaningful conversation of 10 seconds with him where I just say not guilty, and I'll talk with you after my sentencing is over. So he said not guilty, and he exited the courtroom. And after I got done with my other business, I went out in the hallway and I saw my new client as well as his mother and his father. And I didn't think anything of it other than how wonderful he seems to have a supportive family. And I started talking with this young man, and he quote unquote looked normal. And he was nodding yes and no, and seemed very respectful, which I appreciated. And after a few minutes, his father went like this to me. And I followed his father over in a corner, and he said his son's name, and he said, he's special. And I said, I understand. All of my clients are special. He said, no, you don't understand. He has mental retardation. That was the term we used back then. And I said, oh, that kind of special. So in any event, this young man was basically conned by his so-called friends to be a lookout during a series of robberies. And these so-called friends perpetrated robberies across the region. And I ended up representing this young man on a couple of different cases. And I worked very closely with his caseworker. And in the end, we were able to fashion a sentence that made sense for him as well as for the community. And I felt really good about myself. And it's like any quote unquote business, your reputation spreads. So this caseworker started recommending me to other families who had loved ones charged with crimes. And one thing about the disability community, it's very, very tightly networked. So those positive referrals made a tremendous difference. And that's how I started developing an expertise in this area, or I should say a real commitment to this area. I don't have any medical background, any scientific background. I started out life in a PhD program in English, but I just worked these cases. I was fortunate over the years, have been fortunate over the years to work with some very, very good experts. That is to say, forensic psychologists as well as psychiatrists who have educated me. And I've just listened to the clients, I've listened to their families, and I've worked to the cases.
Nice. And I forgot to mention, I think, that you are primarily based in Spokane, Washington, right? But you have office in New York as well.
Well, I have a nationwide practice, and
Correct.
I currently have cases all the way from Fairbanks, Alaska to Naples, Florida, with an awful lot in between.
Nice. So this is good. So, and the idea of, educating yourself and surrounding yourself with experts, hopefully, is a first great practical tip. And your books are reflective of that, because you're writing some aspects of the book, but what you're also doing is recruiting this army of experts to make contributions. So in any one of these books, you're going to flip through the table of contents and you're going to see a battery of experts who have tackled an individual topic on each one of these. And so that is a huge resource, because we don't, like I said, we don't know what we don't know. We need good experts to help us through. And
And I'm very
excuse me.
sensitive. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that lawyers are not doctors. Are not even social workers.
Yeah.
But we need to know about these sorts of things. And we need to know, in some respects, what we don't know, so we can reach out to the appropriate people. And you can't expect a busy lawyer to read a law review article where the footnotes are swallowing the text. And many busy lawyers, particularly public defenders, have huge dockets, and they need fast, digestible information.
Okay, so in the example in the great story that you gave, the first day you're meeting this client, he's got parents who are there advocating for him, and then eventually you're connected. He's already got caseworkers. So the diagnosis is there, and the resources are there, and the support network is there. So it was pretty easy because they came right out of the gate and they said, he's special.
Sure,
A
sure.
lot of times I find I don't know what's going on. I'm getting some cues, but I have no idea. So what would be some practical advice for a lawyer who's sitting around going, I'm not sure what's happening here, but I need to figure this out?
The first thing is trust your instinct. As attorneys, we are avid observers of human behavior. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is our stock in trade. And if something strikes you as just being a little bit off, a little bit weird, you may have an issue. We're not talking about someone who's delightfully eccentric. We're talking about someone whose behavior is such that he or she can engage in meaningful, helpful assistance of their own case. They don't understand the nature of the charges against them. They're making your job very difficult. And one of the things I've done over the years is I've developed a really trusted network of experts. And particularly when I first started out, I didn't know what terms like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or FASD were. But I could call some experts and I could say, this happened at the arraignment, or this happened in my office, or he said this, or he brought me this. What's going on here? And the doctor would usually say, well, it sort of sounds like this. And maybe you should have him talk to so-and-so, or I'd be happy to talk to so-and-so. I mean, it's real easy when you go to visit your client in the jail and he or she says, my father is the king of Sheba and owns the bank across the street. Go over and ask them for bond money. I mean, that's easy. You have an issue.
Right.
But then if you have an arraignment in federal court, and this is a true story, and the judge asks your client what his name is, and you get a copy of the transcript afterwards, and he spends 30 pages explaining what his name is, that's an issue.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier, a lot of times it was just what looks like misbehaving is often is something going on mentally.
And also, sometimes the family says that their loved one has X. Well, it could be that their loved one does have X, but upon further examination and evaluation, he or she has some other issues, some co-occurring disorders. And it's very, very uncommon, at least in my practice, that you have a client with, say, only bipolar disorder or only autism spectrum disorder. So, for instance, with people on the spectrum, it could very well be that because of years or even decades of being bullied and ostracized, they suffer from anxiety or depression.
Yeah.
If you have someone with schizophrenia, they may have a substance abuse disorder because they're medicating in order to
Hmm.
silence the voices or maybe blunt the pain. So we as attorneys need to be open, I think, to layers of diagnoses. And
Hmm.
then we have to convey to the court what those different layers of diagnosis mean, what the nexus to the alleged offense was, and what that might mean if the court is contemplating incarceration.
Yeah, and those layers of diagnoses, couple of points on that. One is that I've seen that just because there are multiple things, then some things get missed, and especially in autism, there's a diagnosis of ADHD, there's a diagnosis of
Often.
anxiety, there's a diagnosis of depression, there's a whole constellation of diagnoses, but they revolve around the sun of autism spectrum
Yeah,
disorder, if you
that's the
will,
primary
and
diagnosis.
they miss the main one, and they're dancing around. And I think a lot of that is because whoever's doing the diagnosis simply doesn't have the deep knowledge about. So what it tells me is that maybe one evaluation, one expert in a case is not going to cut it. Like,
Correct.
yeah,
And that's difficult when you're dealing with a family who has retained you and is already investing a lot in legal services,
yeah,
maybe has posted bond. But I warn them up front, you may need a team of lawyer of experts.
it's probably just as
Yeah.
hard with indigent clients too, because they got to get the funding for these multiple
Well, and then you have
evals.
to persuade the court, and some jurisdictions are more open to that than others. And one thing I should also say on the topic of experts, sometimes families come to you and they say that their loved one has been treated for X number of years by however many doctors. And you need to make it clear to them that the treating doctor or doctors can't be the ones rendering the independent forensic examination. Certainly, it's important for the independent expert to note the various doctors over the years and what the course of treatment has been, and maybe the level of progress and compliance. But it's a conflict of interest for the treating doctor or doctors to be the evaluating doctor or doctors.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good to know. Because when we do have those cases, and I don't see them a ton of the time where they've got a pre-existing relationship, it's super important to highlight the fact that they are receiving treatment and have this history. But there's only
Yeah.
so far that those folks can go. You know what? Let me throw this out to you and tell me if you think this is a nutty way of thinking about our practice. But um, keep in mind, like I spent a lot of my years as a public defender, federal and state. So a lot of my clients come to me. They never had good treatment. They never had good support at home. They never had resources. Some are homeless. It just layers upon layers of trauma and dysfunction and mental health issues that have never been addressed. But even with our clients who have better resources, we still see these issues. But what I basically come to realize, and maybe this is a very Pollyannish way of looking at my practice, but I sincerely believe that most of my clients, there's something wrong with them in some way that is big and small that leads to them running so far afoul of the criminal justice system and messing their lives up so bad that if there wasn't some sort of something going on, some mystery that we need to crack, it's never as simple as they're just a bad person, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, what you said is not nutty at all. It's very complicated.
Yeah.
And first of all, I should stress that people with mental disabilities, and by the way, for your listeners' benefit, by mental disabilities, I mean that's my global term
Yeah.
for serious mental illness like major depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, as well as intellectual and developmental disabilities, things like autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, what we used to call mental retardation, which is now intellectual disabilities. But that being said, people with mental disabilities are not more inclined to commit crimes. Instead, we know statistically they are more likely to be victims of crime. But nonetheless, because of their particular vulnerabilities and characteristics,
Yeah.
they are more likely to get ensnared by the criminal justice system. So,
Yeah.
for instance, someone who is not committing a crime, but maybe in a city park and actively stimming and is scared of strangers, may be scared if law enforcement wearing uniform and badges approach and ask their name, or if they need any assistance or what have you, and they may act out, they may strike out because they're scared or confused or whatever.
Yeah. I think if vulnerability is the word that resonates with me throughout all of this, if we could use one word that really puts everything into this light.
Well, yeah, and that's how so many of our clients who are on the spectrum become vulnerable to committing cybercrime, whether it's because they're taken advantage of by other people, whether it's because they are reaching out for socialization or friendship, whether they are the subjects of online radicalization. It spans the gamut.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, let's see. So what if we have a client who is, and we're going to get to convincing the decision makers in a minute, but just how, if you don't have a client who's got a diagnosis and it's already on the table, and you suspect there's an issue there, any practical advice from a client relations standpoint to delicately say, I think there's an issue here that we need to explore more closely?
Well, there are as many different responses to that as there are defendants in the universe.
Yeah.
And for instance, how you know, you cannot even have that conversation with someone who's floridly psychotic. You just can't.
Right.
You send him or her to the doctor and ask the doctor for some communication skills. If you, on the other hand, have a very well-educated, highly successful white-collar defendant who has mask symptoms, or for whom discussing their mental disability would be very, very embarrassing for them, that's another matter. And it might be couched along the lines of, we respect your privacy, we respect your dignity, but this is a means to perhaps get a better plea or get a lower sentence.
And so tell me what
but you never use the word crazy or anything like that. If there's a relationship with the family can sometimes help. One thing that I am very, very deliberate in doing, if I'm talking to the accused and I have the family in the room, I never talk as if the accused is not in the room. I do not refer to him or her in the third person. That person is not invisible.
Yeah.
And above all else, we want to preserve the dignity of our clients, because we know that this entire process is dehumanizing enough as it is.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier, well, just a minute ago with the white collar guy, masking symptoms. I don't really know what that means, and I'm figuring if I don't know, then maybe some of my people don't know. So I'm going to have you define that.
hiding, camouflaging, maybe denying. So for instance, a person who has major depression may have enough insight to know when he or she needs to just retreat from the
Yeah.
rest of the world. There's a good deal of documentation that Winston Churchill was like that. He called it his blue dogs, I believe.
Hmm.
And then there are some people with bipolar disorder who during their periods of mania are hugely, hugely productive and successful and creative. There are some people with mental illness in their family who do everything during the course of their life to run from their being diagnosed because they remember their uncle or their father being the town weirdo,
Yeah.
and they don't want that kind of
Yeah.
stigma.
Yeah.
I remember, for instance, a number of years ago after Sandy Hook, I was at a seminar and there was a mother of a young man who was on the spectrum. And she said, I'm not letting anyone know my son is on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. I've seen
And
that. I've seen that
yeah,
time and time again in growing up in the schools, and they say, "Well, we could give him this diagnosis, but it'll just stigmatize him, and it's not going to matter for the services he gets, so he doesn't
yeah,
get the diagnosis." Flash forward 10, 15 years, he's in trouble. Now he has a diagnosis, and the court goes, "Well, isn't that convenient? Now he's just getting that diagnosis
yeah,
now."
yeah. And on the other hand, kids can be cruel. And
Yeah.
someone does not want to be called a prejudicial term that first begins with an R.
Mm-hmm.
Or they don't want to be known as quote unquote crazy. So they may appear really, really streetwise in order to fit in. It runs the gamut. So
Yeah.
that's a very long way of answering your
Yeah.
question. What's masking?
I see it with lawyers too. I mean, I know I'm digressing, but it's the same deal. I mean, I've had situations where lawyers have had severe challenges and they worried once they got a diagnosis or had to go on medication, or God forbid they need to be hospitalized, their career would be in jeopardy because
Yeah.
they don't want anyone to know that there's, you know, anyway, well, I want to give my practical advice for a second back to when I've had these situations where I've had to sit down with a client and say, I'm well, here's my first best advice. Here's what we're not always very good at as lawyers. We're really good talkers. We're not really great listeners, and we make a lot of presumptions or assumptions about the words that are coming out of our mouth will be understood, and we're not really good at circling back and saying, do you understand? Like, does that make sense to you? Like, or maybe just repeat that back to me. Tell me what I mean. I know this term, this particular term, it's kind of a legal term. I just want to make sure, you know what I mean by that. Now that's great advice in anything because we deal in legalese and everything else, but that's a lot of the ways where I'm starting to actually connect and listen and see, are they really A, understanding, and B, appropriately responding, and all those types of things. So we get in there and we do like the machine gun rapid fire, da 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 da, because we're busy and I want to make sure and I got to explain this plea and I want to read this police report, and we don't connect on a human level.
Mhm.
But
No,
yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. There's a reason why God gave us two ears and one mouth.
yeah,
But beyond that, I think many times in the case of people with mental disabilities, the attorneys, it's not that they miss the diagnosis or they ignore the diagnosis, but they don't know how to make the diagnosis matter.
yeah,
And part of it is the inherent constraints of the legal system. Because, for instance, you have the standard boxes of competency to proceed and insane at the time of the act. Competency is a very low standard. There, you undoubtedly heard the saying, a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. My variation on that is a court could find a ham sandwich competent to proceed.
Yeah.
So even if you raise as an attorney, you raise the argument that your client is incompetent to proceed, that's not going to go very far. Your client is either going to be found, yes, indeed, competent to proceed, or he's going to be found able to be restored, in which case you haven't gained anything.
Right.
On the other hand, the standard for insane at the time of the act is a very, very high standard.
Mm-hmm.
And the most effective insanity evaluations are done almost immediately after the time of the act, where the forensic expert can get a very, very accurate read of the client's behavior at that point in time.
Yeah, because it's fluid, right?
Yeah. So defense attorneys, they've gotten burned before, and they know it's difficult to fit their unusual client into either of those very, very confining definitions. And the whole point of your show, Doug, is set for sentencing. Most of our criminal cases proceed to sentencing.
Yep.
And indeed, that's where most cases involving mental disabilities land.
Mm-hmm.
So I firmly believe that we as defense attorneys need to learn how to creatively and strategically present mental disabilities as a mitigator at the time of sentencing.
Amazing point, because we think like lawyers and we think, well, if he's competent and this isn't relevant to trial, then I don't need to deal with this, at least not right now, because sometimes we're linear. Let me get to the plea or the conviction, and then I'll think about sentencing mitigation. Well, guess what? If mental health is part of your sentencing mitigation and you've only got a month to prepare for sentencing, you're in big trouble. So I think that's probably a very, very key practical tip for our time together, that don't put yourself in those tiny little boxes of competency or insanity. If you think there's an issue, get on it right away at the beginning, develop it, nurture it, and because it's going to matter. And it's sentencing, everything is mitigation. Everything is mitigation. Now, I want you to draw the line, though, because and I talk about this a lot, but it's, for me, the distinction between sympathy and empathy. It's this idea of, oh, judge, please feel sorry for my client because they have bipolar, or they have depression. They're clinically depressed. Isn't that sad? Please feel sorry and please cut them a break. And that gets us nowhere fast. Those are your sympathy points.
Judges perceive that as an excuse.
Yes.
And
if we're not making excuses, what are we doing?
We're explaining.
Good.
And
okay.
And at least in my mind, insofar as possible, we need to be drawing a nexus between the mental issue and the alleged conduct, and then taking it a couple steps farther. What about that mental issue will make the defendant vulnerable if prison is imposed? And given the person's mental issues, what type of probationary sentence and other forms of treatment would be meaningful in order to protect the community and prevent that person from reoffending? And in the case of a younger defendant, that is particularly important, because we need to be showing the court a path forward. The challenge in these cases is, what jurisdiction are you in, and what is your client charged with? So if, for instance, you have a first-time offender, nonviolent offense, and you're in state court, then there is room for passionate advocacy and getting a good result.
Yeah.
If your client, even if he or she is a first-time offender, but is charged in federal court, then that is a completely completely different ballgame, particularly if a mandatory sentence is in the offing. And at that point in time, it is almost impossible to get the government to negotiate a better plea. And all you can do at the time of sentencing is damage control.
I practice mostly in federal court. The big problem for me is the luck of the draw. It's a lottery aspect. It depends. Is your prosecutor open-minded, reasonable? Does he or she have a family member on the spectrum? Like, are they going to get these issues and be open to what you have to say and negotiate a favorable plea? Or are they going to be a hard-nosed, closed-minded, law and order, black and white,
Exactly.
by the book? And then who's your judge? Got great judges who are super open-minded about this and maybe have their own life experience or just intelligent enough to get their mind around all the issues. And then we got the ones who don't know or don't care, or they're
Yeah.
just hard-nosed judges. And
Yeah, and the moral of the story, or one of the many morals of the story, is don't give up. So, for instance, once upon a time, I was retained on a case. The client had already entered a plea to something which carried a mandatory sentence, and his attorney did not even raise the argument of his disability. And when I called the prosecutor to say that I would be entering a notice of appearance, he said, "Elizabeth, I will fight you with every bone in my body." Well,
because
yeah,
what? Why? Okay.
yes. So I submitted a really, really compelling evaluation. And to his huge credit,
Yeah.
he shared it with the lead detective on the case.
Okay.
And the lead detective said, I knew there was something off about that guy, but I didn't know what it was. So the prosecutor, with the cooperation of law enforcement, was able to convert the plea to something that did not carry a mandatory sentence.
Mm-hmm.
But if we would have given up, that young man with a tremendous future ahead of him would be sitting in prison right now.
And I see this time and time again where lawyers haven't done the work to develop the mental health issues until it's too late.
Well, and the fact of the matter is, not every lawyer is perfect for every case.
Right.
And that's the reality. And another reality is that very, very frequently in criminal defense, families and the accused switch attorneys. Courts understand it, attorneys understand it. It's a fact.
Yeah. Well, that's true.
But the chemistry has got to be there.
Well, and ideally, no lawyer wants to be having to play catch up and be in damage control or have their hands tied about what a plea is and everything else. So I guess don't be afraid to call in reinforcements. If you're any lawyer can handle a case, they just have to know when they need the help and seek out people to get the call in the reinforcements to get the help that they need. Again, I always say this. It's my favorite saying. We don't know what we don't know. It doesn't make you a bad lawyer. It doesn't make you a bad person. It's not that you don't care. It's just that you can't act on something. You just don't have the expertise to do.
And part of it is just curiosity and questioning and not giving up.
Yeah.
And in many respects, some of my best lawyering was done when I was a brand new attorney. Because I was fearless, and I would see something and I would think, well, this can't be right. This absolutely can't be right. Yeah. I mean, I remember the first time that acquitted conduct was calculated in a PSR, and I was shocked. I called the probation department. I said, I think you made a serious typo.
Well, that's so funny. You know that I just recorded an episode exclusively on acquitted conduct
Yeah.
with Doug Berman
Oh,
and Mark Allenbaugh. I don't know if it's coming out before your episode or after, but that is
yeah.
hilarious because we're all like,
Yeah.
what happened to that whole presumption of innocence thing, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know what?
yeah. And yeah, and again, I remember in my youth, I challenged detention at a federal hearing. And the magistrate was a very sweet older man. And he, if you will, he indulged me. I put on evidence and
Yeah.
I took nothing for granted.
Yeah. Well, I love a fearless lawyer. I think that is one of the best. A lot of times lawyers, especially in the smaller jurisdictions, we have to see these people over and over and over again. Just don't want to make waves, don't want to go out on a limb, keep your powder dry kind of deal. I say don't be frivolous, but if you've got the goods, then I remember when I was a baby lawyer, a prosecutor was so mad at me because it was a marijuana case and he offered me a misdemeanor, but the search was so blatantly bad. And I'm like, no, we're going to litigate this Fourth Amendment issue. He's like, but I
Awesome,
just gave you a
awesome.
misdemeanor. And I said, I don't care.
Yeah,
And we won. And the prosecutor hated my guts for it because I made him do all this work.
beautiful,
But
beautiful.
I'll tell you, I think some of my best lawyering, and I'm not being flip here, like my best lawyering is when I'm not wearing my lawyer hat. When I'm sitting
Mhm.
with a client and I'm just asking them what makes your heart sing? What are you into? What was some great things that you do? What do you do? Like just connecting on a human level. And those are the moments when those lights go on and say, "Oh, you had a motorcycle accident. Wow, how bad were you hurt?" Like I wouldn't have
That
known
head
that
injury
stuff.
explains a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so take your goddamn lawyer hat off and you'd be surprised how good of a lawyer you could be. Now, that's controversial because some lawyers don't like to get that emotionally
Well,
connected.
and some lawyers are very good about knowing what their limits are, and they bring in mitigation experts,
Mm-hmm.
and mitigation experts on the right case can make a huge difference.
Yeah, they have better people skills than we do often.
When the defense attorney is thinking about sentencing, the defense attorney needs to think about assembling a team. And first of all, you need to have the forensic psychologist or psychiatrist on board. The report that they give has to be very, very geared to the court. When I read a draft of a forensic report, I don't edit for substance. I'm very deferential to my experts' expertise. And I've probably brought them in because I have a good deal of respect. If there's something blatantly wrong, like Jane Kim is a 25-year-old Hispanic female, and in reality, Jane Kim is Korean, I make the expert change that fact. Um, and if there are some terms that, if you will, are not in English or which would benefit from a footnote, I have that. I suggest that they insert that. Sometimes a report may be so dense that topic headings may be important as well as a table of contents, and some material could be better fit in an appendix. I also like to have on board a prison consultant
Yeah.
who can talk about what conditions of incarceration might be for this person in terms of disciplinary violations, housing, socialization. Will there be adequate meds in the prison formulary?
Yeah.
Is there such a facility close to home if the family unit has always been important
Yeah.
for this person? And I want the audience members to know that you, Doug Passon, have not paid me to say this, but in the right case, a sentencing video can be very strategic. And
Thank you.
know your judge in advance.
Yeah.
And know if this is a judge who has studied every single word you have filed, or if this is going to basically be a cold bench and you need to start from the very, very beginning. The fact of the matter is, in many of our jurisdictions, namely state jurisdictions, judges are elected. They are answerable to the people, as are the district attorneys. And if we can paint a responsible life plan for our client, showing where he or she is going to live, if he or she is capable of working, if he or she needs meds, where he or she is going to get those meds, listing transportation, listing other forms of support in the community, like family, caregivers, etc. Then the judge should feel comfortable and confident giving a second chance.
Yeah, that's hugely important, because we spend all this time explaining to the judge how, I don't want to say broken, but how dysfunctional or how, vulnerable, whatever the case may be. This resulted in that a judge has to have some confidence that this cycle can be broken, that there's hope. We have to have a hope for a happy ending, and we have to do a lot of that work, right?
Yeah, and as trite as it may sound, sometimes arrest is a real wake-up call to our clients and their families. So they have hit the proverbial bottom. They are now in treatment, depending upon how long the case has been pending. They have improved. They have a focus. And that post-indictment rehabilitation is a powerful argument.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes if they don't have the diagnosis, it's an epiphany to them, and it's a renewed sense of relief and hope, like, oh, this is why my life has been spinning so far off the rails.
Yeah.
And now I understand, and now I can do something about it.
Yeah, and a lot of times families, particularly of younger defendants, think that it's just going to go away.
Yeah.
Or
it doesn't
maybe
just go away, does it?
Yeah.
No.
If anything, it's going to get worse. By the same token, on the other end of the spectrum, if the accused has dementia, we know it's not going to get any better. In fact, it's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
And the analogy I use is, once he or she falls off the cliff, there's no coming back. And it could be that condition has remained the same for years, but at some point there's going to be a turn.
I hope that you can give me some hope. I look at our criminal justice system, and it feels like it's just a substitute for mental health. Jail is a substitute for mental health treatment. We don't understand, we don't deal with these things. Do you have some hope that the tide will turn and that our system will be more open?
Depends on what courtroom I've been in that week. Broadly speaking, there are more diversionary options out there, like mental health court, and various other kinds of problem-solving courts. There are more and more attempts to deflect first-time nonviolent offenders out of the system. All of that is good. Some people would argue it's cherry picking. It's only taking the low-hanging fruit. Whatever. We need a variety of different strategies to meaningfully attack this problem. There are more and more police training programs. Unfortunately, there are still far too many situations where the law enforcement who are dispatched to a scene are not the ones within the department who have had the specialized training.
Yeah.
But police training is becoming more widespread. And there are prosecutors, there are judges out there who are open to the argument properly presented.
Yeah.
And I've had the good fortune of working with, practicing in front of many of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. I've seen some pretty miraculous results when lawyers get in early and are thorough and understand this. So, okay, good. I like hope because we swim in dark water. So I'd like to give you the last word. I want to well, I do want to say for everybody who's listening, Elizabeth, again, she does have a national practice. So lawyers bring her onto their team or hire her to represent clients all the time, all over the place. Her website is elizabethkelleylaw.com, right? Now, of course, I'll put the links in the show notes. And just generally, like, keep your eye on her, follow her, because, well, you've got a newsletter you could sign up for on your website, but I don't know if we're friends on Facebook or whatever, but you're always posting good articles that you see from this source and that source, and every one of them is something that's going to benefit me in my practice. So I encourage you to connect with Elizabeth.
And I will say this, for any lawyers out there, I am always happy to brainstorm with you about strategies that you can use or maybe not use in your case.
Yeah, and maybe just experts like you. That's, for me, it's the hardest part.
It's key.
I need
It's
this
key.
expert who knows this. I need the right expert for this thing, and you work with a ton of them, so that may be a great resource too. So
yeah, no, I've built a good Rolodex over the years, and I'm happy to share that.
Love it, love it, love it. And of course, if anybody wants to do some light bedtime reading, there's 4 of these books out there. The latest one, again, is representing people with dementia, but they are practical guides. It's right there in the title, and there's a ton of super practical advice for lawyers and clients too. You don't have to be a lawyer to read that book. It's written it's written in lay people's terms.
Exactly. Yeah. I have told my my experts who write chapters, do not talk like a doctor, and minimal footnotes. But on another note, I've had parents, I've had clients who have ordered my books, and they have found them helpful.
Are those on where would we get those books?
Easiest way is to go on the ABA's website, Shop ABA.
Okay, excellent.
But the older books are available on Amazon.
Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate you, and I know that we'll be talking soon.
All right, take good care.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassenlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.